The Yoon administration has vowed to engineer a soft landing for the housing market as prices continue to lose ground, and this phenomenon appears to be a broader global trend. So what are the causes behind the falling home prices? What have been the consequences of this trend? And what are some of the countermeasures against it? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Residential real estate in quite a number of countries has reportedly entered a phase of plunging prices for the first time in more than 10 years. Now, for more on this, I have Professor Kim Yong Jin at Sogang University live on the line. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Professor Thomas Davidoff at the University of British Columbia joining the session virtually as well. Professor Davidoff, again, a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right, Professor Kim, we'll start with you then. Let's begin with a bit on the plunging property prices here in South Korea. How severe is this situation?
Okay, to evaluate the situation of a property market here in Korea, let's first look at the number of transactions and the price changes in apartment house market, which is the most important properties for Korean people. In 2022, the number of transactions and the price drop of the apartment house hit the lowest level in its history. According to the Korea Real Estate Board, by October 2022, the number of transactions of apartment house was 262,000, which is the lowest level since the official statistics were reported. The price of the apartment house dropped the most since 1968. The price dropped by 10% compared to that of 2021. If the November and December numbers, stats are included, it would be worse. And also including the lower story buildings. I mean, in Korea, when the building is, taller than 5 stories, we call apartment house, and less than 5 stories, we call villa and some other names, multi-owner, properties. The price dropped by 8.18%, which is exceptionally low. The price of all low-story buildings, including low-story buildings, dropped only twice. In 1997, in the hard currency crisis, and also 2008 global financial crisis. In particular, the price in the northern part of Seoul and all other metropolitan area except a certain part of Seoul dropped by 20% to 40%, where young and less income family live.
Right, I see. And before we delve into the reasons behind the frightening fall, Professor Davidoff, what can you tell us about falling home prices there in Canada? I mean, how severe is the reality there?
Well, it really matters what market you're talking about. Our largest market, Toronto, has had the worst problems, and some segments there are down by as much as 20%. On the other hand, Montreal and Vancouver, which saw enormous price gains through COVID during the low interest rates, their sales activity has fallen quite dramatically, as it has everywhere in Canada, but prices are down more along the lines of 8 to 10, 15%, depending on the submarket. So certainly significant price declines. But of course, prices are much higher today than they were at the beginning of the COVID crisis.
Right. And now then, Professor Kim, what do you believe is behind the plunge in prices of homes first here in South Korea?
Okay, to my ideas, there are 3 major, most important factors. The most important reason is that the hike in the interest rate. Last year, the U.S. Federal Reserve Board dramatically increases the interest rate by 3.5 to 3.75% point from 0.5% to 4 to 4.25%. The Bank of Korea also increased it from 1% to 3.25%. The dramatic increase in the interest rate of the central banks affected the interest rate of loans, which in turn led to the serious drop in the real estate price. The second factor is the government policy, like DSR, what is called debt service ratio, and LTV, loan to value, and also the property tax for multi-house owners, which constrain the amount of loan that property buyers need to have. Property buyers who do not have enough money cannot purchase the target property due to the lack of money, which leads to the drop in the property price. The third factor is economic downturn. Recently, the rate of economic growth of Korea, just went down to 1% level. Real estate is a durable good, which is affected by the purchasing power mostly. The low economic growth affect actual income of people and also the psychology, intention to purchase of those properties.
Right, I see. And keeping in mind what Professor Kim has just said, Professor Davidoff, how do you explain the plunging prices there in Canada? Is it also because of the central bank's hiking of its interest rate hike?
I completely agree with what Professor Kim said. Interest rates are the #1 factor here. In some markets, I suspect the end of COVID is having some impact. We saw much larger price increases in outlying and distant suburban areas. Those saw larger price increases than the core urban areas during COVID, and that was because people wanted more space, and you usually have larger homes there. And there was no reason to pay to save on a commute as long as people were thinking commuting was out of fashion. As COVID ends, we may see more dramatic price declines in markets that have become more difficult to live in as people get back to work.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, what have been some of the more concerning, if I may, concerning consequences of this dramatic cooling of home prices here on the local front, do you think?
Well, when this, property price market cooled down dramatically, there are, several problems. First of all, we'll let you know the financial support for the construction, such as the project financing, will be dwindled as we see here in Korea, right? And then if the money does not go into the market, we'll see many house construction projects, stop. And also implementers and construction companies may go into bankrupt, which in turn affect the stability of financial systems. And secondly, the behavior of renters will change. In Korea, we have a very unique system, which is called 전세 rental. 전세 rental, right? The 전세 means, the renter put 50 to 70% of property price into deposit, which will be returned to the renter after the rental contract ends. 전세 rental had played a great role as a safeguard in the property market in Korea for a long time. However, rising interest rate will push people to move to monthly rental payment rather than 전세 rental, which will make the inequality in property market much further. As a matter of fact, recent months, renters who prepare monthly rental payment increases dramatically.
Right. Professor Davidoff, what would you say have been the rampant repercussions, perhaps, of plunging property prices in Canada then?
Well, we haven't seen anything too bad yet. Even with rising interest rates, employment has remained strong in Canada. That may not last. Obviously, central banks want to fight inflation. And, the thing you worry about the most is a recession where people are losing jobs and income. Haven't seen that yet. We do have a lot of very indebted households, and some of our investors in real estate are particularly indebted. And so an interesting thing to watch for is as condo buildings, apartment buildings get completed, can the buyers afford to actually pay for the units that they've promised to purchase? If not, you could get into quite a bit of a mess as developers scramble to sell units and maybe sue home buyers who walk away from their obligation because they're not able to secure financing. I don't think we've seen that in huge numbers yet, but it is a concern should the property market remain weak this year.
Right, I see. Professor Kim, let's now move on to efforts perhaps to counter the consequences of the slowdown in the real estate market. The Yun administration here has chosen to ease a host of property-related regulations. Do tell us a bit about them, and do include perhaps your thoughts regarding their potential impact.
Well, yeah, as we mentioned, the Yun government moved really fast to stabilize the property market by boosting up the demand on the houses. The policies include deregulation for reconstruction, and also the requirement of actual residence, and tax reduction, redemption of excess profit, and mitigation of acquisition and possession tax for multi-house owners, and allowance of loan for rental businesses. Probably the policies Yun government propose may boost up the psychology of people so that it helps stabilize the property market. But considering other factors like high interest rate, the Fed, U.S. Fed, and also Korean Central Bank will increase the interest rate a little bit more. And so high interest will affect this kind of price, and also low economic growth. The effect of the Yun government policies will be limited. I'll explain it further later on.
Right, and while we wait for that, Professor Davidoff, Canada, for its part, started this year, 2023, with a 2-year ban on residential property purchases by foreigners. What is the background behind this particular ban, and how do you assess its impact?
Well, originally in Canada, we had Toronto and Greater Vancouver seeing the largest price increases, far larger than the rest of the country. And both of those jurisdictions have clamped down on people who buy properties who don't live in Canada. So there have been large taxes, up to 20% of the purchase price on foreign buyers in Canada and Ontario, in British Columbia and Ontario, as well as taxes on empty homes. So if there isn't somebody living in the property, there's an additional property tax every year. So that means that we don't have a lot of foreign buyers or empty homes left in British Columbia or Ontario because of these taxes. So a foreign buyer ban, as has been implemented, can't have too much impact, one wouldn't think, in Ontario and British Columbia, the markets that have seen the largest price increases, because there just aren't that many foreign buyers left to ban. However, there are some vacation markets, and possibly Montreal, another city that's seen larger price gains, where you might see bigger impacts. All of Canada is now struggling with housing affordability since the onset of COVID, whereas the affordability problem, a problem everywhere, had been largely concentrated in Vancouver and Toronto.
Right, I see. And Professor Kim, do you suppose perhaps that a similar ban here in Korea would serve to perhaps ease housing concerns for locals?
Well, when it comes to housing concern, at this moment, it is a little bit different from the previous years, like when the hikes of property price, and now we are experiencing price drop in housing markets. So if we ban foreigners to purchase residential property for 2 years, the property price go down further. So I don't think it's a good idea. And considering Yun government lifted the ban for actual residence of 2 years to boost up the demand, 2-year ban on residential property purchases by foreigners wouldn't help, the soft landing of the property market in Korea.
Right. And Professor Davidoff, aside from the ban on foreign home ownership, then what else do you perhaps propose to better tackle Canada's housing challenges, if I may?
Yes, like South Korea, Canada has a significant affordability problems. And maybe unlike South Korea, we have a real land use problem, which is a very large fraction of our land is devoted to single family detached homes. So a single housing unit on a large lot, even in markets where tall apartment buildings are called for. And so that only serves a very small fraction of the population that can afford such a luxurious product. And so opening up land to more intense development, I think most commentators believe is a really important step, and governments are slowly getting there. Of course, neighbors don't like density near them, and it's politically challenging, but I think Canadian governments have started to see that issue. The other side is demand, and as a country, we tend to have low property taxes and high income and sales taxes. So while our regulations have historically said don't build housing, our tax system has said do buy housing. And so a shift in taxation, away from income and sales and towards property would, of course, help renters, but it would be costly for owners, and so it's politically challenging.
Right, I see. Professor Davidoff, this is an impromptu question. Would you say Canada is a rental society, or is home ownership the norm there?
Well, most people own homes. If you go to the city of Vancouver or Toronto, you have a larger fraction that are renters. However, the current generation coming of age, I think, is getting more used to the idea of renting, because even as prices are declining, with higher interest rates, housing has become less affordable to buy. And so, many people in their 20s and 30s just don't believe they're going to be able to buy a house, whereas I think it was sort of the norm that if you were professionally successful in past generations, you'd have that opportunity. And Canadians are quite interested in a group in the opportunity to invest in home ownership.
Right, I see. Professor Kim, generally speaking, what are your prospects with regard to Korea's housing market in the year 2023? Do you foresee a further plunge in prices this year?
Yeah, actually, there are positive and negative factors both in the property price next year. The positive factors include UN government policies like the mitigation of acquisition and transfer and possession of multi-house owner tax, for multi-house owners, and also tax benefit for rental businesses, and lifting up the requirement of 2-year actual residence for newly purchased houses. These factors affect the demand positively to stabilize the property prices. But considering the U.S. Fed will, raise the interest rate at least by 0.5% point this year. And accordingly, the Bank of Korea will follow the step to increase the interest rate. The downward pressure on the property price will be stronger. Moreover, thinking of the factors that economic growth will be quite low, as expected by many experts, and the current, price bubble and the property price is not popped yet, So as IMF projected, the property price in Korea will go down at least 5% to maximum 10%. It sounds, gloomy, but, I believe that'll be happening.
Right, I see. And Professor Davidoff, what is your outlook for Canada this year?
Well, of course, I don't get to decide what happens to Canadian home prices. That will largely be an outcome of macro factors, which themselves relate to geopolitical issues. If the Ukrainian situation could be resolved peacefully, that would certainly help. I agree. I think the outlook is not great. The market, I think, has been remarkably stable. The true economic cost of ownership has risen dramatically with interest rates, if you believe these high interest rates are here to stay. So, my best guess is a moderate continuation of price declines. But there are many immigrants to Canada every year that tend to stabilize the market. Betting against our housing market has gone awry for commentators for some time. So, best guess, a moderate decline along the lines of 5 to 10% this year, but certainly could see things go the other ways, particularly if inflation gets under control and central banks are able to ease off on the interest rates.
Right, I see. Professor Davidoff, we have like about 4 minutes left, which is why I'm going to ask you yet another impromptu question. Generally speaking, for an average Canadian in their 20s or 30s who's making an average income, how long would it take that person, that particular person, to purchase a house in Canada?
Well, it very much depends on the housing market. In Alberta, you can get a decent home for $500,000. So you need $25,000 saved. Incomes are good in Alberta, 5 years of hard work and savings, keep the partying to a minimum. And it's doable on a strong income. In British Columbia, and particularly Vancouver, it's a very different story. Getting a decent place to live, you're looking at $750,000 at least, and that's not really necessarily very family friendly. And so, 10 years of saving, and you hope prices don't rise too much to lock you out when you're done planning for your $750,000.
Right, hopefully. Professor Kim, another question to you then. We have talk about the Yoon administration seeking to boost supply of homes for the younger Koreans who need to have more, who lack the finances to buy expensive homes. But what are your thoughts on boosting supply of homes amid a plunging population? I mean, down the road, how will this affect us?
Right. The dwindling number of young population may affect the property prices, eventually. But at the moment, young people want to have their own single homes. They don't want to share their properties with their families, and they want to be, separated from their families. So we need more, houses for these young peoples. Even though in the future, the number of, properties may be, down. And also the Yoon government support for young people, but price itself is too high. For young people to have those kind of houses in metropolitan area. So what we need to introduce like mortgage systems like the U.S. and Canada. Professor Davidoff mentioned that, young people in Calcutta and other cities may, take 5 years to purchase, houses. They don't pay full amount of money to purchase, houses. They just, pay down pay, and the, rest of their life they repay the, the mortgages. So if we, introduce those kind of systems, it'll be much helpful for young people to own their own houses and to enjoy their life. And sometimes, we may boost up the birth rate too.
Right, hopefully that will be the case. All right, Professor Kim, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Davidoff over in Canada, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Issues and Insiders. We'll be back same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday. Join us then.